Okay, well, lovely. Welcome this morning, everybody, to this Webbox webinar on website accessibility for a more inclusive experience. So moving into the content for today. So there's four key sections that we're going to run through. These are understanding website accessibility, so what it is, why it's important, and some key areas around it. The key principles of website accessibility, so what should we be looking at, which has the most impact for our users through web accessibility. Implementing accessibility best practices, so what we can actually do to put these things in place and make sure that our users are having that good experience. And then have a look at some tools and resources that you can use yourself to help essentially, test the accessibility and make sure that what you're actually doing is having an impact on your website. So first up, section one is understanding website accessibility. Now we've just had the hands up, which seemed to work quite well. So we're starting off again with a question here. So how many of you on the call today considered website accessibility during your website's build? Cool. See some hands going up. Awesome. Cool. Thank you. Just trying to see. Oh yeah, this bar here. This one might just be for me. Cool. Yeah. So quite a few of you, which is great to see. I think, it's one of those things which really is important, and you'll see why if you've not really thought about it before. Across your whole user base. It's something, and I think it's growing in importance as well, and kind of acknowledgement from the sector. So it's definitely something to have a think about. So first up, understanding website accessibility. What is it? So website accessibility means ensuring that your website or digital content, just in general, is usable by everybody. So that obviously includes people with disabilities or impairments, but essentially, like I say this all the time when we talk about accessibility, it's about making your content as easily accessible to your entire audience. So everybody, regardless of ability, they can access your content in a much more easy, manageable way. And why is it important? So, as we said, accessible design, it benefits everybody. So, not just those users with disabilities, but it could also be people with situational challenges. So, perhaps, they've got temporary injuries or temporary, you could have a cast on your hand or something that's, or like RSI or something that stops you kind of interacting with the mouse as easily. Or it could even be something as simple as poor lighting. So, as we'll talk about some of the areas of accessibility as we go through, things like color choices, color contrast. If you're in an area with poor lighting, it might make it much more harder to interact with that content and that digital content. So things as the easiest situational challenges are things to think about as well. There's also legal frameworks to have a think about. So we've got the UK's Disability Discrimination Act. And since that's come into place, websites are kind of obliged that their websites are accessible to all users. You have to make sure that you're essentially, considering these things in the content that you're outputting. You definitely can't be seen to treat people with disabilities less favorably, should we say. So it's really important that you consider this on your website. And there will be different levels as we'll kind of dig into. But it's very important to keep abreast of. Also, there's an ethical duty. So as digital creators, as marketers, as people that are constantly, creating content and providing services to people, there's a responsibility to build those inclusive experience, and we want it to empower all users. So it's about making people easily have access to our content, and ultimately, it could be that they gain something out of it, whether that's a service or a product. But even if it's educational content or guides or anything like that, it's about giving them access and the ability to access it without any issues. And then from a business case, thinking of it as a direct benefit, it helps you to reach untapped market. So like I say, if your website currently or your digital content is not accessible, there's going to be a big market that you're kind of missing out on that could be potential customers of yours. but you're just not getting in front of them because your content isn't accessible. It also improves customer satisfaction. So for people who have those impairments or disabilities, they're going to be happier. They're going to be more satisfied because they can actually access that content. But also people that are just, may not have disabilities or impairments, but they are interacting with your content on a regular basis or need your products or services. These things are going to make it easier for them to also access that content. So again, it helps that customer satisfaction and reduces things like bounce rates. Although the probably term to look at that now is increases engagement rate. So it's about increasing that customer experience and giving them a better experience when they interact with you as a business as well. And talking about the audience impact and that kind of untapped audience that you could be missing out on, in the UK alone, the stats say that there are 10 million, he said 100 there, 10 million disabled individuals with a spending power annually of 80 billion pounds. So it's a huge market, really, that if you think about, you're not actually considering at the minute. Like I say, it could be a big revenue stream that you're kind of missing out on from your target audience. So it's very important to consider from an ethical perspective, but also from a business perspective as well. Then moving into section 2, so we've got the key principles of website accessibility. So there are 4 key sections within this that we're going to sort of dig into, and the acronym is POUR, so POUR. And the first key principle here is making sure your content is perceivable. So it must be presented in a way that everyone can perceive, regardless of their sensory abilities or their abilities to interact with the content itself. And examples of what that looks like can be things like alt text for images. And an example of that is as in this screenshot here. So as you'll see, this is just a screenshot of a piece of code from the Webbox website. And essentially, if you don't know what this actually means, on the left-hand side there, you've got the kind of square bracket with the IMG, which means this is an image. You've then got the SRC tag, which is the source, so where the image is coming from. And then on the right-hand side, you've got this alt attribute. So what that means is that if someone is using a screen reader or has a different way of interacting with the website, it will tell them what is in that image. So in this case, it's a beautiful cottage in the countryside. So it just means that if that is not there, there's no context to what that image is. It can confuse the user. It creates that bad user experience. So by adding things like this, it just helps the user to understand what they're kind of interacting with. There are also kind of other benefits of this in terms of, thinking of SEO as well, how bots will interact with the content on your website and pull context out for what images are and things like image search. So there's things to consider from that side of things as well. Also, captions for videos. So this is ensuring your content is accessible to visually or hearing impaired users. So you think, if maybe watching a video could be too overstimulating for some people, then they can use the transcript or the captions to access that content instead. And then obviously, one to think about as well. I think traditionally for me, for years, accessibility was about people with visual impairment. So whether it's blindness or color blindness or other things like that. But thinking about hearing impairments is a huge thing at the minute as well. And came across an organisation that works in I guess the kind of disability sector, and highlighted that to me a few years ago. And I think it's more and more important, and technology is evolving around that as well all the time, which is really important. So. If you're doing video, if you're putting video out, make sure you're putting captions in place. And also, if you can use things like transcripts to go along with that, then obviously really useful as well. The second key principle here is making sure it's operable. So you should be able to navigate and interact with your website using various tools. Now, the tool that we naturally go towards would be a mouse. So interacting, clicking around, navigating content, or starting to create our journey throughout a website or app. But most people will interact in this way, but some people solely will interact with a keyboard. So you've got to think about how your website or application react when people use a keyboard just on its own to navigate around the page. Is it easy to do? Or do they get stuck in certain places? Also, things like assistive devices. So, where I talk about people who potentially blind, they might be using things like screen readers, and we'll talk a little bit about those down the line as well here. But they might be using screen readers to access the website. So, how does that interact with the content itself? Can they easily navigate through? And there's some things we'll talk about that can help that as well. Things that can block devices as well are where you've got like obstacles in the content. So it could be time limited content, thinking things like carousels or if content is kind of coming and going off the page, it can just make it again harder for people to kind of access that. So you want to make sure that you've got as few obstacles in place as possible to make it easily operable. The third key principle here then is making it understandable. So your website's design should be intuitive and easy to comprehend. And I think, like I say, without doubt, this goes across for all of your users. It should just be easy for people to interact with your online presence, because ultimately you want them just to learn more about you, learn more about your products and services, and ultimately, go through that that kind of user journey to ultimately get in touch with you or make a purchase. And this includes things as simple as make sure you're using clear instructions. So if somebody needs to, how do they get in touch with you? How do they get to the next page? What does this call to action do? Using really clear language will just help make it easier for people to comprehend and interact with your website. Using consistent navigation as well. So consistent navigation is something which is really core across your website or app, and navigation is just a really important thing as well. So making sure it is consistent. I've got an example here which I'm hoping works now. So if I press play. So this is actually the old Webbox website, and I had this clip available, and they're hovering around on the homepage. You click about, it goes to the next page, and you might, looking at that video, it might be quite hard to tell the difference in terms of what has actually changed. But if I put them side by side like this, you can see that the top screenshot here was the homepage, and then the screenshot below is the About Us page. So you can see now that they're side by side that the navigation has changed. So the free digital audit link has changed from the kind of grey square to a green circle. The services link is missing from the navigation links that were there already, and also it's moved down by about 50 pixels on the page. So making sure that it's consistent throughout all of the pages that people are accessing is going to be really important to make sure that it's, again, usable. People know where they are. People know what they can kind of interact with and go from the pages they need to access the content they want. Also, avoid using overly complex language. So from a content creation perspective, this is one that's kind of really interesting to look at. And if you look at the kind of guidance online, they talk about sort of reading levels that you should aim your content towards. And now, obviously, that's going to differ depending on probably the industry you're in and also who your target audience is. But if you're talking to even like a sort of general target audience, the advice is to write in a year 8 or 8th grade reading level, which is, kind of like 12, 13, 14 years old. And as an example, best-selling novels are generally a year 7 reading level. And then graduate level audiences are a kind of year 10 reading level. So it's one thing even that we come across quite often when we're doing things like digital audits or talking to people about new projects and their current websites is if they're in an industry which is quite technical, their content can tend to angle towards that technical side of things. So whether it's science-based, whether it's tech-based, it talks in a very technical way. Whereas you've got to think about making that content as easily understandable and digestible for people as possible. So you can still have the technical information on there because some of your readers might want, or some of your users might want to access that. But just have a think about what most users are going to see first, and then if they want to dig into that more technical information, you can still keep that in the page, but not have it probably front and center. Obviously, again, depending on who your target audience is. Oh, lost me to click at. And then the fourth and final key principle here is making sure that it is robust. So your content itself has to be compatible with current and future technologies. What we're looking at here is that longevity. We don't want it to just, you do updates to the accessibility on your website now and how your content is accessed, and then 3 months down the line that's changed. You want to make sure that you've got that in place for a good number of years. And things that you can do here are adhering to standards like the WCAG 2.2 standards. I put 2.2 in there because that is the current standards. They kind of launched more recently from 2.1 to 2.2. Where they've added some kind of additional things to take a look at. The WCAG version 3 is actually being worked on right now, so obviously it's something to keep keep in mind in terms of what's happening from an accessibility perspective, and when that gets released, having a look at what's changed and what you potentially need to update to make sure that you've got that kind of long-term usability in place. So those four sections, those four key principles, we're making sure it's perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So that's your POUR acronym there, POUR. So the things to really think about in terms of making sure your content is accessible. Then section 3. So here we're looking at implementing accessibility best practices themselves. So first up is content structure. So here we want to make sure we're using semantic HTML to create a logical flow. So what does that actually mean? What is semantic HTML? So HTML is a bit like the kind of image tag that we looked at earlier. With the alt attribute on it, that is HTML. So it's essentially the building blocks, the code behind your website, and the structure of your website. Now, if you're using things semantically to make a logical flow, you're using things like headers, like H1s, H2s, etc. And I'm sure most of you on this call this morning will have interacted with this with some sort of content management system, whether it be WordPress or Webflow or anything that you can kind of build websites in, and it will give you options to add these different types of headings. And one way I always like to describe it as well, if you haven't come across that, is it's very similar to if you're using kind of a Word document or a Google Word document or anything like that, where you have the different hierarchical headings. And it basically, as you would in a Word document, you want to treat them the same sort of way you would, same as that on a website. So the rules are you should only ever have one H1 on a page, and that is the kind of the main title, the purpose of that page. So whether it's about us or our services, or if it's a kind of blog page, it might say insights or blog, or it might be the title of the blog post itself. So you have that one H1. You should never have more than one of those. And then from H2 to H6, which are the different heading levels, you use those in a hierarchy to build out your content. So the next heading down in your content from the H1 should be H2. And then if there's sub-content for that, you use a H3, and then similarly. So you can have multiple H2s for the main content sections. And then if there's sub-content in there, then you go to the reduced headings. The reason for this is twofold, really. So from a user perspective, if someone's using a assistive technology like a screen reader, the screen reader will literally go through the headings in order from top to bottom. So it'll start with H1, it'll go to the H2s, go to the H3s. And if you've ever used a screen reader or seen or heard someone using a screen reader before, it reads through these incredibly quickly. And as obviously people have built up their skills and their use of these screen readers, it's almost, if you're not used to it, kind of imperceptible what it's saying. But it will read through the headings, and once it reads something that the user is interested in, they'll click and it will go into that topic of content. It will then go through any subheadings within that. Again, click and it goes into the content in that hierarchical way. So again, it makes it easy for people to access that content through assistive technologies. Also then, as well, from an SEO perspective, using that hierarchy, it gives the importance of the content and the structure of the content and context to any search engines that are kind of crawling your website as well. So it definitely has benefits from both sides. And as an example of what this will look like, this is essentially, like a test content page, which I think I nicked off the old Webbox website. Now, if you look at this from top to bottom, um, I'm saying it definitely does for me. So hopefully it does the same for you guys. Is the headings are a bit all over the place. The top heading, where do you want to be, is smaller than the subsequent headings. It just all looks like a bit of a mess. Like your eyes don't really follow it around very well. And the reason for that is that these are the content types, or the content tags that we've used for these bits of content. So the top one here, this title, is a P tag, which is just a paragraph, general paragraph tag. Then we've got two H2s. Then there's a H1 in the middle. So, even though there's only one, it shouldn't be there. It should be kind of higher up at the top of the page. Again, we've got Ps, and then H2s, H3s at the bottom. So that's what they're currently set as. Now, a way to kind of restructure this content so that it makes more sense, from a user perspective, but also from a search engine, a semantic perspective, is to do something like this. So you can see immediately, hopefully, that this looks much more digestible for somebody to come along and read this content. So regardless of if you're using assistive technology or not, where do you want to be stands out massively at the top. We then see a kind of subheading within that, the numbers. We can see a list in there, again, content, which is quite easy and nice to interact with. There's a quote pulling something out of that content, and again, the headings at the bottom, those four headings, they have that hierarchical structure from a size perspective. Now, the way that we've rearranged this is that you've got the H2 at the top here. Obviously, the H1 would again be right at the top. We then used a H3 for the numbers, which is the subheading, the subsection of where do you want to be. Using lists, this is something that we always advocate as well. If you've got like chunks of paragraphs of text, if you can pull that out into a list format, it just makes it more accessible and easy for people to kind of scan and get that content. We've then got a block quote. So again, this is something that I'll often recommend people do, especially in things like blog posts, or if there's a lot of text content, is if there's something really important in there, whether it's a stat, whether it's a resource, or something which you think is particularly engaging or important within that content, pull it out as a quote so that firstly, people can see that more easily, but they may be drawn to that and then consider sort of reading the rest of the content. Nobody generally sits down and goes, I'm going to read this top to bottom. They'll scan it first in terms of what is interesting to them and then go back into the content in more detail. But then you can see at the bottom here, we've got the H2, then we've got H3s and H4s. So it's that hierarchy of how the content goes together. Again, any questions on that, just let me know. But hopefully that makes sense. And some other best practices we can do here as well. So we want to provide text alternatives. So as we've looked at earlier, things like descriptive alt text. A tip here as well is that you can go through all of your images on your website and add, hopefully depending on what CMS you're using, add the alt text to each image. And generally what that should be is a description of what is in the image. If the image is purely decorative, so it's not necessarily in the content, you don't have to add an alternative text to it because it's, it might be like thinking of the Webbox website, you've got that kind of wave in the header area. So it's not really, something that needs it. But if the content is on a sector block, or it's in your content, or it's in a blog post, you want to add an alternative text attribute to it, and that is describing what is in the image. So it could be man stood at desk delivering a webinar to his laptop. So it could be kind of that kind of description. So again, the screen reader will pick that up and read what it is to the user. Transcripts for multimedia as well. So thinking if you're doing things like podcasts, videos, anything that you're kind of adding to the website, which isn't just text related, if you can add transcripts to those, it helps. Firstly, like I said earlier, kind of visually impaired users, so they might not want to watch a video or interact with it in that way, and it enables them to access that content. But also, again, this has that kind of two-way advantage, because if you embed a video, and it actually when I was putting this together, it made me think of doing it. We don't actually do it with our webinar page on the Webbox website, but we embed the video, and then if someone wants to watch it through video format, then happy days. And then below that, you put the transcript content. Now, obviously, like I say, that helps people from a usability perspective, but also it will help from an SEO perspective because search engines will be able to access that content, give it context, and talk about rank you for the things you're talking about in that video multimedia content. So it definitely helps from both aspects. Then keyboard access. So we want to ensure that all interactive elements on your website, things like forms and menus. So obviously really important, firstly from navigation perspective, but secondly from a conversion perspective, we want to make sure people can fill out forms and complete forms and ultimately get in touch with you. So it's really, really important that these can all be accessible via a keyboard without requiring a mouse. So if, obviously most people a majority of people can use a mouse and access the forms and menus through that, but think about it from a keyboard perspective as well, how that people can kind of, if you've not ever used that before, come across it before, you can tab through content. So using the tab key on your keyboard, if you hit that, it will, when you're on your website, it will start to highlight elements and kind of run through them. So again, it's just a good way of kind of testing that and seeing how accessible it is and how easy it is to access different content on the website. Color contrast again is a really important one, and one that often comes up through audits and looking at accessibility on websites. And this is where you want to maintain a high contrast ratio between your text and the background colors. So anywhere that you put in text on a background, whether it's call to actions, obviously the main page content, anything in kind of like headings, header areas, or hero sections, anything like that, you want to make sure that the text and the color of the text and the color of the background have a sufficient ratio, so it's basically easy to read. It makes it improves the readability of that content. That'll be for people with visual impairments like color blindness, but also depending on how low that ratio is, it will become inaccessible for anybody who's kind of accessing the website. So the higher you get that ratio, obviously the better. But it's really something to have a think about and consider across the website from a design perspective. Obviously, I mentioned visual impairments there. And then responsive design also. So when you're designing your website, or if you're looking at the if you're looking at the design of your website, responsive design is really important from an accessibility perspective because you want to make sure that the website works across all devices and screens, which ensures the accessibility features you're using or the accessibility of the features of your website are available across desktop, tablets, mobiles, and everything. So again, it's not just thinking about one device and how people kind of interact with that, how then accessible is your content on a tablet or on a mobile device. Is it the same content? Hopefully it should be, because we've, again, on previous webinars, we talked about this loads. But you need to make sure it's the same across both. And if you've not come across, you probably have, but if you've not come across web responsive design before, this is what it essentially looks like. So this is the Webbox website. I'm just resizing the viewport here, and as the viewports get smaller, so it's unlikely someone's going to be doing this with your website, but as it goes to a smaller screen size or a bigger screen size, the content in the website adjusts. So like headings move, the menu moves to the bottom for mobile, the kind of menu items and things shrink down and change. So this is how responsive elements work on a website. And ultimately, this provides that consistent experience as well. So thinking about the kind of user experience, making sure that if, regardless of the device they're using, they're having a good experience with your business. That's a key element there as well. And a little pro tip here is to ensure that all fonts and buttons are readable and clickable on smaller screens. So one thing that quite often can be missed as well is that you might, on a desktop, set the font size to something like 16 pixels. But as you reduce down onto a mobile, it stays at 16 pixels, which might be quite small on a mobile. So think about how you can kind of like increase that size on the different screen sizes, and also the clickable area. So if you've got things like carousels, are quite often a culprit here. if you've got really small buttons or navigation elements, make sure there's a big enough area for, I've got big fat thumbs, so make sure that people can actually tap on those and access them easily as well. And ultimately, by putting these things in place, you may have seen this guy before if you've been on one of my webinars, but you'll have users that are happy like this guy, which is what we want. And I try and get this guy in all my webinars now. But yeah, ultimately, what we're looking at here is accessibility, but it's about, as I said at the start, that user satisfaction and that user experience, and making sure that everybody who comes along and interacts with our content and with our business leave happy. And then moving into the last section, last but not least, are some tools and resources that you can have a look at to help implement your accessibility and test that accessibility as you go through as well. So first up, some automated tools that you can use. So a couple of tools to mention. One is Wave, and there's also the Google Page Speed Insights tool. So I'll start with the Google one. Google Page Speed tool. Typically, people will use it for performance or page speed, and just checking how it's performing from that perspective. But it now does give you, there's 4 metrics. So you've got performance, which is speed. I believe it's usability, accessibility, it's SEO, accessibility, and best practices. So when you run this on your website, you just pop your URL into the tool and click go. It analyzes the site, and then it will give you that accessibility score, and it will tell you things like if the color contrast for text in the background is not quite enough, if your links don't have discernible names, things for like screen readers, if you're missing alt text, all these kind of things will get flagged up. So it's again a really good way of having a quick check in terms of how accessible your website is. Then the Wave tool. This is like a full-on accessibility checker, which is free, and the way that we've used it in Webbox is as a Chrome extension. So you can install it on your Chrome browser, and this is basically what it looks like. So I've run it on the BBC website. On the sports page. Well done to the Wales team yesterday for qualifying. And if you click go, so you open up your web page, you start the plugin itself. It opens this bar on the left hand side, and then it adds all these kind of tags across all the different elements on the web page. Now it'll tell you how many errors you've got, how many contrast errors there are, how many alerts there are, what features you've got in place, all these kind of things. And you can click across these tabs to get more detail, understand the order in there is important from that tabbing. So using your keyboard to get through things, as I mentioned earlier. And you can kind of toggle all these just to dig into them a bit more detail. But again, it's if you want to get really deep into the accessibility, this is a great tool to have a look at, and how accessible your website is and what you can do to improve it. You've also got manual testing, so things as simple as using screen readers yourself to see how the content is kind of being interacted with. As some examples of what you can use here, there's NVDA or VoiceOver are 2 free tools. Now, VoiceOver is an Apple tool which comes pre-installed on like Mac devices and iOS devices. So if you've got a Mac or iPhone, then you might be able to use VoiceOver to interact with your website and check what it comes back with. NVDA is also a free tool. It stands for non-visual desktop access, and essentially it's a screen reader tool. So you can, like say, download it for free, test it out, see how your kind of website interacts with it, and where possibly it's kind of falling down. But it will just give you that experience of other people that are using screen readers will have as well on your website. Also checking your color contrast. So this is something that we always do through the design process on projects to make sure that we're, getting the color contrast right for users' websites. And a tool that you can use here is called color contrast checker. Nice and simple. It does what it says on the tin. Now, if you just Google color contrast checker, this will probably come up. I can also put a link in this to my follow-up email, just so you can access it as well. But it's the URL is just colorcontrast.cc, and simply all you do here is you come in, if you can get the hex code of the colors you're using, then you paste in the background color on that left-hand input. You paste in the foreground color in the right-hand input. And it just automatically updates. So the background color and the foreground color will change based on what you put in. So that background color FFE66D is currently that kind of yellowy mustard color. And then the 22222 is that kind of gray what the text is. And what it's telling you here on the right hand side of the pass is the different levels. So we'll talk about these levels in a second, but if the text is larger, the two on the left show you it's passing a double A and a triple A standard in the WCAG standards, and the left two pass are if the text is more of a normal size. So again, something to really think about in terms of, as I said, as you kind of use responsive design and the text shrinks or changes size, that can obviously make it more accessible or less accessible, even with the color, because you might have a color contrast which works at a larger size, but as you shrink that down, you lose the accessibility levels basically. So something to really think about and consider through that. Then also referencing the accessibility guidelines themselves. So we've talked about the WCAG, which stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And by looking at these, it can look quite overwhelming when you first start digging into them, but just go through them, especially if you've run the tool through, you'll run your website through certain tools and there's different elements that have come back, then you can reference these specific ones within these guidelines to sort of see how you can look to improve them. And as I said, there's essentially three levels within these standards. So you've got level A, double A, and triple A. Now, level A is kind of like the basic of the most basic level, almost to the point where you haven't really even considered accessibility at all on the website. Double A is a great one to aim for, and this doesn't just necessarily mean that your whole website is double A. You could be pushing towards double A, but it might mean that some of the elements on your website are triple A, some of them are single A, some of them are, and the majority of them are double A. So you can have different elements on the site which are at different levels as well. But again, you can kind of dig into what those mean. When you get to the sort of AAA level, you're really looking at things like the kind of government website or those kind of council websites where everything is, it is super accessible because it's like black and white, really kind of like simplistic layouts and kind of minimalist design. So not everybody either wants to or can get to that level for their, through their branding and things like that. So that's why AA is obviously a great one to aim towards. Some user testing as well. So obviously you can do a lot of testing kind of internally, but there's also going to be great benefits from collaborating with users that actually have disabilities to understand any kind of barriers or get feedback that you can kind of implement through that. You can also run workshops this way. So you might have kind of individuals that you can work with or kind of external organizations that can work with. But if you run workshops, you can either do it over Zoom or in person, get people in, get their kind of real world feedback on your website or on your content and understand where it is you might be failing or where it is that you're excelling and doing really well. So that's really important. And by doing this, you're going to gather that actionable feedback that you can put in place to ultimately help improve your accessibility and make sure that you've considered all the different kind of users and different abilities as they come to the website. So thank you for listening to those bits. So as a review, we've got understanding website accessibility. So accessibility is about creating a really good user experience for everybody who comes to interact with our website and with our content across the web, regardless of their ability and sort of access levels. There's some key principles of web accessibility. So we had that POUR acronym, POUR, so making sure it's perceivable, operable, robust, and understandable. I just said those out of order, but I was trying to remember them as I went through them. Implementing accessibility best practices. So things like alt attributes on images, make sure that you're putting those in place. One tip I didn't actually mention, I think I was going towards it and then I tangented off, was if you're looking at putting those in place through your website and maybe you've got lots of images on your website, there are actually AI tools now that will do that for you. We've tested them in the past. We've used them on our own website, and it's kind of scarily accurate how well they create the alt tags. And even if you do that as like an initial burst and then go through and tweak them and edit them, then it's just going to help you from an admin perspective. So yeah, have a think about that as well, how AI can help save you time. Things like transcripts as well. We talked about captions on videos, making sure that any content, multimedia content specifically, which might not be as accessible, can be accessible for all users that want to gain insight from it. And also thinking about that kind of semantic HTML, the structure, the page structure, the way that you're putting content together. Make sure that it's accessible from a screen reader perspective when people are coming and accessing it through that way. But the example I gave, even anybody reading that content, it's much more well organized and much easier for people to kind of scan and read. So again, from an accessibility perspective, it has both those advantages. And then the tools and resources we talked about. So make sure you have a look at those screen readers, the NVDA and the VoiceOver if you've got Mac, the Wave plugin tool or the Google Page Speed Insights, which also gives you accessibility scores, and also the color contrast checker. Again, just a really good one just to make sure that you're or what that's really good for actually is if you use something like Wave or Google Page Speed Insights and it says, the color contrast isn't right on this image or in this section or on this call to action, you can put the two colors into that and kind of adjust them until you get to a good a sufficient contrast for the accessibility point. Hopefully it's something again within the branding colors and guidelines and things like that, but it just will help you see kind of how far out you currently are. But a good way to have a look at it. Cool. Well, if anyone has got any questions at this stage, feel free to pop them in the chat. I'll give a few seconds, see if anyone pops anything in there. I do believe. Oh yeah, hang on. Cool. There is a Q&A here. Lovely, cool. So thank you, Sam. I've got a question here in the Q&A bit. I think people can access the chat, but if you can't, let me know. But yeah, Q&A or chat's absolutely fine. So Sam says, how do you recommend implementing a video transcript that doesn't majorly alter the layout of the page? Great question. One way that you can do this, and it's, I guess, something that we can typically be advised for, as I was talking about the kind of technical content and things like that earlier as well, is that you can have the video if you've got the transcript. Obviously, a transcript, if it was like a transcript of this video, it's 30, 40 minutes long. It could be massive. You can do it and put it into an accordion. So the content is still there on the page, but it's should we say hidden for the majority of users that are coming and don't necessarily want to directly interact with the transcript, although it is there if they want to interact with it and access it. That content will also still be available for access through assistive technologies. So it's not hidden from them, even though it's like visually shrunk down on the page. That will still be able to get in there and access that transcript, as long as you again think about the kind of schema and the markup you use to make sure that it's relevant and linked to that video. But yeah, that should be a good way of doing it. And again, it's one way that we say you can hide that more technical information, or if somebody wants to access something which is more kind of for a specific target audience, which is maybe a bit more niche that you're targeting, you can do things like that as well for that kind of content. Cool. Oh, excuse me. So cool. Aisha, I've got a question from you as well. If the image has a file name that describes what it is, but no alt text, is this not picked up by the screen reader? That's a good question, actually. So I don't think it is. I can double check after this call, but I'm sure that the screen reader will specifically look at the alt text. Now that may have changed, over the years. So I'll definitely double check that. But I'm sure that the essentially the source or the image name is just there for it to reference where the image is. I think I've read things in the past, and again, I don't like being too vague, so I'll double check this afterwards. I'm sure I've read things in terms of like SEO, where that will look at things like image name to kind of understand what's in the image, but I'm not sure if screen readers do it. So I will double check that for you and come back to you in the follow-up email as well on that one, because I'm interested myself now. Cool. Any others? I can see a couple of here. So, how often should I audit my website for accessibility? So, I guess, it will depend on your kind of target audience and how important accessibility is to that audience and to you as a business. But, you want to be doing this kind of regularly. So, ideally, if there's a major update to things like the WCAG guidelines, then you want to make sure that you're kind of checking yourself against that and making sure you're kind of staying up to date with it. But at least kind of every 6 months to a year, I'll be checking everything and making sure that you're very well up to date with the latest guidelines and not falling behind. Because things even like as you're adding content to website or the team is, or you're adding images over time, you might miss alt attributes, you might miss oh, I've accidentally added a H1 there when I shouldn't have. So all these kind of things can build up over time. So yeah, make sure you're kind of checking it regularly. And one here. What is the easiest way to improve website accessibility quickly? So I would say focus on those kind of quick wins. So things like the old attributes we talked about on images, color contrast is a big one, hence why it's in here. It's one that pops up quite commonly, but make sure that you're kind of checking that on a regular and implementing it, especially if you're going down the route of kind of a new website, make sure that's all checked through the design process as well. And I guess things, as we talked about as well, where you've got the kind of keyboard navigation, you can test that through Wave, but also test it yourself just to make sure kind of everything is interactive for as many users as possible. So yeah, have a think about those kind of key things that we've looked at through this session, and that will definitely give you a good boost for your accessibility. And finally, thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate you all joining.